Riprendiamo le fila del nostro discorso con la terza relazione di oggi pomeriggio del dottor Simon Maria Kopf, la cui formazione è molto articolata. Io mi limito a ricordare le tappe principali appunto della sua formazione filosofica a Innsbruck, riguardante le scienze religiose a Edimburgo e in una prospettiva di teologia sistematica prima a Oxford e poi al King's College. Nonostante la giovane età ha già fatto parte di 3 progetti promossi dalla Fondazione Templeton. Il primo aveva per titolo Authority and Innovation in Early Franciscan Thought. Il secondo, anche quello concluso, aveva per titolo temi riguardanti la Divine and Human Providence, e infine quello che attualmente sta seguendo come Principal Investigation e che ha come riferimento l'Università Humboldt di Berlino, ha come titolo A Virtue-Based Approach to Providence, Bridging the Analytical Continental Divide in the Central European Divine Action Debate. Nonostante la giovane età, ha già diverse pubblicazioni al suo attivo. Io mi limito a ricordare la monografia scritta insieme a Ignazio Silva su Divine and Human Providence, Philosophical, Psychological and Theological Approaches, pubblicata dalla Routledge nel 2020, ma tradotta anche in lingua spagnola. Siamo molto interessati quindi a quanto avrà da dirci circa Providence and Divine Action on Conceptualizing the Doctrine of Providence. So I'm very grateful for your presence here, and I'm pleased to present your speech. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. The topic of tonight's talk is Providence and Divine Action on Conceptualizing the Providence of God. And I want to start with a methodological note. So when thinking about the doctrine of providence, a first thing one could do as a theologian is to look at Scripture, how Scripture portrays providence, God's guidance of the world, divine action, and so forth. And as Catholic also to consult the tradition, how the councils and so on speak about providence. And one could try to take it from there. And if one takes that approach, perhaps somebody will reach a definition like, okay, apparently it's stuck. Okay, wonderful. One could perhaps reach a definition like this. Providence consists of the dispositions by which God guides all his creatures with wisdom and love to their ultimate end. This is in the Catechism. And then the Catechism adds, providence works also through the actions of creatures. To human beings, God grants the ability to cooperate freely with his plans. Now, the first thing to note is that, and I speak now as a theologian, from a dogmatic point of view, there are quite some objections about this more teleological view, what is today at times called the ordinative view, especially in the contemporary German debate. And secondly, this is a conference, a philosophical conference, and so I suggest that we might revisit this definition at the end of the talk, but take for the present purposes a rather different, more philosophical approach. So what I suggest for the time being is to start with the question where to locate providence. There's an interesting debate in the Middle Ages about this particular question. And there are two extreme positions which locate providence in the divine intellect and the divine will, exclusively in the divine intellect and the divine will, respectively. And there are a range of positions in between these two extremes. So let's first look at two examples. So for example, Peter Lombard in his sentences says that providence is a species of divine knowledge. So it's a particular kind of divine knowledge and therefore pertains exclusively to the divine intellect. On the other side of the spectrum, we have John of Damascus, at least as it was perceived in the Middle Ages, who says that divine providence is the divine will. So it seems that he identifies, or at least locates it exclusively in the divine intellect. We have all sorts of positions in between that might lean more to one or the other end, and I want to mention here only two in passing, namely analytic models of providence. And I know that there's a whole range of models, and we have already heard a few, but what strikes me as interesting here is that very often, and I will take Thomas Flint as one example, they will make clear that providence has both an intellectual and a volitional aspect or dimension, but that they think that a robust theory of knowledge, especially of knowledge of future contingents, plays a crucial role in the doctrine of providence. So it's key in understanding and resolving problems about providence. So I would kind of in the scheme put it more on the intellectual side for that reason. And then on the other side, but not as the extreme position, but as an in-between position, we have so-called divine action models. And here, I mean in particular, models of divine action in the so-called divine action debate, and that is the focus of my talk today. So I want to look specifically at divine action models, which, and this is something that Reinhold Bernhard has shown in his habilitation thesis, that with the rise of voluntarism, we see that providence moved from the intellect to the will, and then became something, not an attribute of God, but something in the world. And I think in contemporary divine action models, we see something similar going on. So let's start with the divine action debate then. There's a common objection in the divine action debate, and the background of this debate, or actually the debate itself, is a kind of attempt to revitalize the doctrine of providence. It started in the 1950s, late 50s and 60s, and the root was a biblical dispute. So the question was, what's the central message of the Bible? And the biblical theology movement's central claim was that divine action is the central message. So Scripture is about the words and deeds of God, but especially about the deeds of God. And then the question arose in then present biblical scholarship, well, how actually to understand the divine action portrayed in the Bible? So this is where the philosophy of language kicks in. And one famous example is Rudolf Bultmann, who says that in actual fact, if we look at the modern conception of the world, the modern worldview, we see that the world, or the cosmos, is a causally closed system. And for that reason, he thinks that divine action in an objective sense is something methodological. So we cannot objectively posit divine action because the cosmos is a causally closed system. And this is in fact the first premise of what has become one major objection in the divine action debate, which can be stated as follows. So first major premise, causally determined systems or causally closed systems preclude Oster, and I will come to that in a moment. For now it's sufficient to see that this is a very robust understanding of divine action in the world. Second premise, nature is a causally determined system, therefore nature precludes Oster. And the common reply to this objection is to challenge the minor. So what scholars in the divine action debate, and especially in the science-religion dialogue question, is this thesis that in the modern period, so perhaps in the modern period, if you take it as a historical sense, like in Newtonian physics, but not in the sense of the contemporary understanding of the world. So in the contemporary understanding of the world, in most theories, nature is in fact an indeterminate or conceived as an indeterminate system. So they challenge this second minor premise, arguing that nature is in fact not a causally determined system, and so it doesn't follow from 1 and 2 that nature precludes Oster. So that's the standard reply to this challenge. Now it seems to me that the first premise is in fact worth revisiting. So this, what is sometimes called the liberal view from Bultmann to Kaufmann, to name just two prominent examples. So why think that causally determined systems do preclude divine action in the world? And the reason why I think that this is relevant is that if you deny the major, then it doesn't matter what the minor is, because if you undercut the major premise, then it won't follow from 1 and 2 that nature precludes divine action in this sense, whether or not nature is in fact causally determined. So that's the reason why I think it's worth revisiting that premise. So the rationale behind this premise is what today goes under the term theophysical incompatibilism. That's a term by Kirk-Wachter McNally. And this position states that natural and divine causation mutually exclude each other in a zero-sum perspective. Now it's very important to emphasize at this point and explain what Oster means, because this position doesn't say that it's generally the case that divine and natural causation mutually exclude each other. It's just a particular kind of divine action that mutually excludes each other. So the particular kind of action in question here is objectively special divine action. So Oster stands for objectively special divine action. And that is a divine action that is special as opposed to general. So general divine action would be creation and conservation. Special divine action is a divine action that goes beyond the creation and conservation of the world. And this divine action is secondly objectively special, meaning it's not only a human response to an event, which would be subjectively special divine action, and neither is it just because God by this event furthers his purposes, which would be called functional special divine action. So it's a kind of divine action that goes beyond creation and conservation, that is efficient causal, and implies some sort of particularity. Now, the interesting philosophical point about this is that according to theophysical incompatibilists, creatures have a genuine independence of agency. So their being depends obviously on God, on God's creation and conservation, but when it comes to acting, all of a sudden this incompatibility emerges. And a nice way of putting this is to ask, well, what's their stance on Rana's axiom of the direct proportionality of divine and human causation? So it seems that these authors deny this axiom because they think that the more God acts objectively in the world, the less there is to do for natural causes and vice versa. So what you have to do is actually limit the divine causation and the natural causation to insufficient causation to avoid competition between the two. And I think this is a theologically or also philosophically a position that is up to debate or can be questioned, and it's at least not the traditional understanding of the relation between creaturely agency and divine agency. So I put a question mark here about this theophysical incompatibilism. The point I want to make today is that I think that this theophysical incompatibilism is in fact an import from the philosophy of action. So just as libertarian free human action, one might reason, presupposes causal indeterminism, so the thesis that not all effects are fully determined by antecedent causes, so too divine action in the world presupposes causal indeterminism. So we see here a link between human action and divine action. And we see a theory that applies to the human case and has is a substantiated theory in human action, the incompatibilist theory, applied univocally to divine action and to divine case. And this is, in fact, what I take to be one of the two major premises of the divine action debate. It's premise 2 on the slide. So divine action is best modeled on human action, and I will quote here William Alston as one clear proponent of this view. He writes, "Our thought of God as agent is clearly modeled on our understanding of human agency. Thus, a natural and frequently taken approach to our problem is to start with human action concepts and determine how much of them is transferable to the divine case. In traditional terms, can we speak univocally of divine and human action?" And Alston's answer is, yes, we do, and we have to. So he advocates a view where we start and should start with human action concepts and then model divine action univocally on human action. And I think that the theory of theophysical incompatibilism is a result of this move. There is a more fundamental premise to this debate, which then links divine action to divine providence, and that's the first premise on the slide. Providence is best conceptualized in terms of divine action. So if you want to understand what providence is ultimately about, you need a robust notion or theory of divine action and can thereby explain what providence is all about. And I think in the divine action debate, one reason is the immediate origin of the debate, which I mentioned previously, namely the biblical theology movement's central claim that the message of the Bible is a proclamation of divine action. And that actually started the whole conversation about divine action and ways to revitalize providence. I'll give you one further quote here. Robert Russell, who is a well-known proponent of this view, says, "The problem of divine action lies at the heart of the doctrine of providence." So these two premises, I think, show why this debate evolved the way it did. And the premises link providence to divine action and divine action to human action. And the way to conceptualize divine action is to start with human action, apply a concept of human action at times univocally to divine action, and thereby gain a concept of divine action, and divine action then explains how providence works. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I want to suggest a slightly different framework. So I suggest to change the framework by not taking action or action terms as starting point, but prudence, so the virtue of prudence as a starting point. And there's one famous quote in the De Veritate by Thomas Aquinas, who suggests exactly this move, this pairing between divine and human providence. He writes, "That which is understood about God, because of the weakness of our intellects, we cannot cognize unless from that which is in us. And so that we know in what way providence is in God, it is to be seen in what way providence is in us." So Aquinas here suggests that if we want to understand and conceptualize providence in God, we should start by looking at human providence and then take it from there. So let's do this as an explanatory exercise. So, prudence in the classical tradition, as the recta ratio agibilium, is a habit, a habitus, that enables a person to cognize the truth about the right action in given circumstances. So prudence is a virtue that orders means to ends, and at least according to Aquinas, it not only determines appropriate means to an end, but also in what this end consists in a given moment and under these particular circumstances. So we have to have knowledge of the particulars, and prudence enables us to find appropriate means or determine the appropriate means hic et nunc in this given situation. Human providence is the principal part of prudence, and it orders to future ends by anticipating and providing for or against this future. There's a nice quote by Cicero, which goes as follows: "Providence is the knowledge of good and bad things, and of those that are neither good nor bad. Its parts are memory, intelligence, providence. Memory is that by which the mind recalls what has been. Intelligence, that by which it sees through what is. Providence, that by which something future is seen before it was made." So Cicero suggests that prudence has three kind of times in view. A prudent person needs to have memory, remember the past. It has to understand the present. And third, anticipate the future to provide for or against this future and order human actions accordingly. So on this traditional understanding of prudence and human providence, we have a close link between human providence and action, but human providence is and prudence are not identical to it, but rather they order action. So it's a teleological understanding, and it's slightly it's similar in that it has to do with action, obviously, because it's recta ratio agabilium, but it's different in that it's the virtue that orders action, it's not action itself. So as a next step, I want to look more closely at human and divine providence and work out some similarities and some dissimilarities between the two. So prudence is an intellectual virtue that presupposes moral virtues. So prudence is located in the intellect, but presupposes the will, and it presupposes a good will. So the specific, the uniqueness of prudence is that it's not only an intellectual capacity or ability, but prudence also implies the good volitional use of this capacity. So it has a moral dimension to it and therefore presupposes moral virtues. As regards the intellect, we can say that prudence presupposes knowledge of the universal as well as the particular, because prudence orders means to ends in the now under these particular circumstances. So a prudent person needs to know the particular as well. And finally, as concerns the will, the end of prudence is a good, is something that is desirable. Now, if by analogy we transfer that to the divine case, and now I say by analogy because I do not think that we should use this notion univocally, as for example suggested by Alston, so by analogy. I think what's interesting here is that then we have both the intellectual and the volitional dimension I mentioned at the beginning. So yes, we have extreme positions where providence, divine providence, is exclusively located in the intellect or the will, but most theories have a combination of the two. And so I think that's something that benefits this approach. Second, on the intellect side, here again, providence presupposes knowledge of the universal and the particular, at least if you think that providence is universal in the sense that it's providence over all things, and I think now as a theologian that is one of the few things that we can agree from a dogmatic point of view, but that's just a little side note. And then finally, as concerns the will, the end is again a good, and I'll talk about what kind of good this might be. Now comes the more controversial bit. This approach means that the notion of providence becomes ordinative, it becomes end-directed. And I say this because in German, in the German theological discourse, this is doubted. So people like Georg Essen, with whom I work on the project, think that this should be rejected for theological, dogmatic reasons. But I don't think that is the case, and in fact, I think that this teleological approach or ordinative approach actually speaks for this approach or model. So providence, or rather prudence, orders actions and means to an end on the creature side, and on God's side, providence orders creatures to an end. So summing up the similarities, we can come up with a definition something like the following. Human providence or prudence is the human ordering of means and especially actions to a future end that is a good, and divine providence is the divine ordering of all creatures to an end that is the highest good. Now the highlighted bits, I think, show the similarities. So the similarities are that it's about ordering, that it's about an end-directed ordering, and that this end is also qualified as a good. But obviously there are also dissimilarities, and as a next step I want to look more closely at the dissimilarity according to the Fourth Lateran Council. For every similarity between creature and creator, there's a greater dissimilarity. So let's look at the dissimilarities. On the human side, we obviously have a limited range of actions. So according to Aristotle, prudence is about future and contingent events. It's about future events because we cannot change the past nor what is already present. And it's about contingent events because even future necessary things are not at our causal disposal. Now that's a huge difference in the divine case, at least if we go with the classical understanding of providence as universal, that is, as concerning all creatures. That obviously includes the past, the present, and the future. So God is guiding not only our future, but obviously also the past and what is already present. And God's providence includes both the contingent and necessary. So it would be strange to say that God say the necessary laws of nature are not, God isn't responsible for that or guiding that laws of nature. A final point about human providence. Traditionally conceived, it consists of three acts. First, to deliberate well. Secondly, to judge correctly. And third, to command efficiently means to an end that is a good. And obviously, there is a temporal and inferential process. Because prudence is a virtue, it's a dispositional attribute. It's something we gain by repeated practice. The end is a future good, and that's clear also from Cicero's quote, example, that it's about providing for against the future. And a prudent person orders herself and others. So her own actions and other persons or means. Now, in the divine case, at least in classical theism, we have to say that providence consists in the efficiently ordering of all creatures to the highest good, but we have to exclude any reasoning process. So we would have to say that it's only about what Aquinas would call simple insight and efficiently commanding, but that's something that only holds within classical theism. That's why I put it in brackets. The second difference I see is that we can't say that it's a dispositional attribute, but it's an immutable essential attribute, at least again on the classical view, theist view. And finally, the end is not any good, and certainly not a future good, but is in fact the highest good. And this, as a side note, I think is in Catholic dogmatics also the case, but just as a short side note. And finally, a fourth difference, that God orders all creatures, but not himself, if you think that he is his own end. So then God's providence would be of creatures, but not of himself, ordering himself. So, coming back to the definition from before, we have seen certain similarities, but there are also dissimilarities. So human providence or prudence is the human ordering of means and especially actions to a future end that is a good, and divine providence is the divine ordering of all creatures to an end that is the highest good. So again, the emphasized parts show the dissimilarities between the two. Now, before I revisit the question of the relation between providence and divine action, I want to take one final look at the chart I started with and present two examples that are actually quite similar, that try to combine these extreme positions of locating providence exclusively in the divine will and exclusively in the divine intellect. So we find in the early Franciscan tradition, first of all in John of La Rochelle in a manuscript, the following distinction, and the distinction is well known. So providence is defined in two ways. In one way, it refers to the precognition of that which is to be governed. And how? And in another way, it refers to the execution of that which has been provided. So John of La Rochelle presents this theory in response to Peter Lombard and John of Damascus. So he wants to rescue both these positions, and he comes up with a resolution by differentiating between the precognition and the execution. So he says that Peter Lombard is right insofar as the precognition is concerned, and John of Damascus is right insofar as the execution is concerned. The same position, slightly modified, we find in the early Franciscan Summa Hallensis. It reads as follows: the providence of God refers, properly speaking, to the divine reason, divina ratio, by which all things are governed. And in this way, the providence of God exists only by itself. In another way, providence refers to the execution of providence, namely the government itself. And in this, it is for the most part through a creature. So we see that here the emphasis slightly changes. The distinction stays the same, the terms change, so now we have ratio instead of precognitio. But what the Summa Hallensis tries to explain is what we saw in the second quote from the Catechism, namely that creatures can partake in God's providence. So the Summa says that providence, insofar as it's the ratio, is immediate to God, and there is no participation in that. But insofar as we mean the execution, obviously, then it can be and often is mediated by creaturely or secondary natural causation. And the same position, which is well known, we also find in Thomas Aquinas. Two things pertain to providence, namely the divine reason of the order of things provided for to an end, and the execution of this order, which is called government. And again, the context is to explain how mediation or participation in God's providence is possible. So coming back to the chart, on the intellect side, we have the ratio ordinis rerum infinem, which is located in the intellect and is called providentia, and in the voluntas, the executio huius ordinis, which is then called gubernatio. And the first, the ratio, is immediate to God, it's eternal and universal, and the gubernatio allows for a mediation through natural causes. It's temporal and it's also universal if you take the two modes of execution, namely kind of divine causation with or without secondary causation together, then it's universal. If it's just one of the two, then it's not. Okay, so I want to come, before I conclude briefly, back to where I started. So it seems to me that the first definition we found in the Catechism depends. So the word disposition here is slightly ambiguous, I think, because it depends on whether you think this is a disposition in God or in a disposition in a creature. And if it's in a creature, then I think it actually refers more to what Aquinas at times calls fate, namely the disposition, so the government in secondary causes, but at least with the distinction between the gubernatio and the providentia, so the execution and the ratio, we can account for how creatures participate, which is the second quote here. Now the point I want to make, and this is where the presentation leads, is the following. So I started off by saying that today in the divine action debate, which leans more towards the will side, the starting point is human action, and that is univocally applied to the divine case, and then a notion of divine action is developed, and with that we explain providence. I suggested to take a different route, namely not to model providence on human action, but on human providence or prudence. That was the first step, and the second one is to differentiate between the ratio and the executio. And if we do that, we can reason for the following conclusion. So providence, as the eternal reason of the divine ordering of creatures to an end that is a good, is prior to divine action in the world. So I would locate divine action of the world in the doctrine of gubernatio, executing this order temporally, and it also specifies it. Obviously, this priority cannot be a temporal priority, but is a causal priority, or in analytic terms, an explanatory priority, depending on your notion of causation. So if you have a very broad understanding of causation, then it might be causal, otherwise explanatory priority. And so then we could suggest that divine action is providential if and only if it orders creatures to an end that is a good. And that's a rather broad definition, a good, because you might want to account for goods that aren't beneficial for the particular creature, but are for the good of others. So I put a good, or if you want to identify that good as the highest good with God, then you might say that divine action is providential if and only if it orders creatures to God as their final end. Okay, so summing up, once again, the point of my presentation was that it's interesting to ask where we can locate certain theories of providence on this scheme between intellect and will. Obviously, if you think that God is personal and has intellect and will in this sense, then it's very interesting to locate it there. And my suggestion about the divine action debate and divine action models in particular was to start not with divine action, modeled univocally on human action, but rather with prudence. And the point is there not that I have anything against divine action, but rather the point being that I think it shouldn't be univocally applied in that sense. Okay, and with that I shall end. Grazie per la vostra attenzione.